All right, so in today's lesson, we're going to be covering average rate of change. And we're going to break down a couple things before we look at our examples. And the first thing is really the actual definition and how average rate of change will lay out. Okay, so the average rate of change is the average of a function, which is used when the graph is nonlinear. Okay, so we use average of a function when the actual graph of that function is nonlinear. That means it's not a straight line. Okay. So that's where the word average comes into play. Now, rate of change is also called slope. So if rate of change is also called slope, slope is our m. And when we look at m, we look at it as being our change in y over our change in x. Okay. Now, with that being said, when we go to find the average rate of change, so we're looking at lines that are not straight, okay, and we're going to be finding the actual slope of those lines. What they're going to do is give us two intervals that we have to find the slope for. Okay. And the way that we're going to use that is we'll use what we call the T chart. And as you can see here in the example that I did, one side of it will be the X, the other side will be your Y value. Okay. And we're going to use that T chart to help us find slope. And the way we're going to set it up is we're going to use the points that they give us in the intervals. We're going to put it in the T chart and we're going to find the changes that happen on the Y side by subtracting, and then we're going to find the changes that happen on the X side by subtracting. And once we find those changes, we're going to take it then and we're going to divide the two changes with the Y change at the top divided by the X change at the bottom, and then that will give us our answer. Okay? So what we're doing is finding the average change that happens between an interval dealing with whatever function they provide us with. Okay? So now that we have a little bit of better understanding of what we're about to do about for average rate of change, let's go look at our first example. All right, so in our first example, it says, what is the average rate of change of the function g of x is equal to 2x to the third minus 5x squared plus 7 over the interval, which is x is equal to -3 to x is equal to 4. Now, if we look at that in our important things, we know we're looking for average rate of change using this equation for the interval x is at -3 and x is at 4. If we go through our steps, our first step says we're gonna start our T chart. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and draw a little T chart with x and y values. It says now we're gonna input the x values in the chart. So the x values that they gave us was -3 and 4. Okay, then we got to find the corresponding y values by substituting the x value that they gave us for the interval into the equation, and then we got to solve to get a result. So the equation, what they gave us was 2x to the third minus 5x squared plus 7. So I'm going to replace those x values with numbers. But before I do that, I'm just going to write it out with me leaving blanks with parentheses. Okay, so I know that I'm following the right template. So the first number that they gave me was -3. So I'm going to fill in the -3. Now I'm going to go to Desmos and I'm going to type that in. So in Desmos, I'm going to type in 2 parentheses -3, close that, and I'm going to raise it to the third power minus 5 parentheses -3, close that, and raise it to the second power plus 7. And that's going to give me -92. And that's what I put right beside the -3 in my T chart. Okay, so now I'm going to have to go back and do the same thing for the 4. So I'm going to go 2 parentheses 4 raised to the third minus 5 parentheses 4 squared plus 7. Now I need to know exactly what that's going to equal. So, but we just got to remember that I did replace the 4's where the x's should be. So basically I swapped out the x for a 4. So if I go to Desmos, start my new line, that's going to be 2 parentheses 4 close parentheses, we're going to raise that to the third power. I'm going to do minus 5 parentheses 4 parentheses and raise that to the second power plus 7. And that's going to give me 55. And I'll put the 55 beside the 4. Okay? So now that I have my t-chart, what I have to find now is what we call our changes. Our change in y and our change in x. So in order for us to find our change in y and our change in x, it is taking the numbers that are in the y column and subtracting them, and taking the numbers in the x column and subtracting those. So in Desmos, we can use it again. So if I got negative 92 for my first x, and I got to subtract that from 55, that's going to give me negative 147. Okay? And then I'm going to do the other side, which is negative 3 minus 4. And that's going to give me negative 7. Now, the last step is that we take and divide the changes. Remember that our changes are our change in y first, divided by our change in x. So our change in y was negative 147. And we got to divide that by our change in x, which is negative 7. So when we divide that, we get 21. So the average rate of change for the function, which is g of x, will be 21 for this example. Now let's move to our next example. All right, so in our second example, it says a graph is shown below. It says, what is the average rate of change over the interval, which is x is equal to 2, to x is equal to 6. So the important things is that we're still looking for average rate of change for the interval x equals 2 and x equals 6. First thing we're going to do is set up our t-chart. So we're going to go ahead and do our t-chart. And it says we got to find the coordinates of the start and the end point. So the start point is going to have an x value of 2. So if we go to our graph, we go to the x line at positive 2, which is here. We're going to go up until we get to the actual graph, which is like the V. And then we're going to go over to the Y to see where it meets. So we'll do that again. So they told me my x was 2. I'm going to go up to my graph line. And then I'm going to go directly into the direction of my Y. So I'm going to go this way. So that means my Y value is 2 also. So the order pair that I need for my first, which is my start, is going to be 2, 2. Okay, now we're going to do that one more time for the x, for 6. Okay, so we go to 6 on the x-axis. Now we're going to follow that line up until we get to the graph line. And then once we get there, we'll turn and go directly towards the y. And it gave me 3. So you can see it again. We go to 6 is where they told us to start. We go up to the graph line. Once we get to the graph line, we turn and go to the direction of the y, which is 3. So that next order pair will be 6, 3. So that is us finding the coordinates for the start and end. Okay. Now we filled in the t-chart. So we did step 3. Step 4 says we got to find that change. So I need to find the changes that happen between my y and my x. Okay. So in Desmos, if we do what it says, the changes are going to be subtraction. So it's going to be 2 minus 3, which is negative 1. And then the other change was 2 minus 6. And that gave me negative 4. Now we got to set up for division. When we divide, it's our change in y. So our y side over our change in x, which is our x side. So that'll be negative 1 divided by negative 4. And if you simplify that, when you're dividing two negatives, they become positive. So the actual average rate of change for this one will be a positive 1/4. Okay. If you're not sure what it will become, you can type it in Desmos. Then it'll probably give you a decimal. Then you can change that decimal back into a fraction. All right. So that's how you find the average rate of change from a graph. So the first thing you do is create your t-chart. You find the coordinates on the graph line. So we found our coordinates to be 2, 2, 6, 3. And then you put them in the table. Find your changes between your y's and your changes between your x's. And then divide. And we got our slope to be 140. All right, so now let's move to our next. So our last example says that the table shows a function. It says what is the average rate of change over the interval -2, which is less than or equal to x, which is less than or equal to 1. Okay. Now, in order for us to find the average rate of change, so let's highlight the key things: average rate of change and the interval that they want us to find. In order for us to do that, we're going to start with our t-chart. Now we're going to pick out the values for the interval from the chart. Now they gave us the x values of those intervals, so we're going to go in our chart in just a second and pick out the y value that goes with it. We're going to fill in our t-chart, and then we'll do what we've been doing. We're going to find the changes between the y, changes between the x, and then divide. Okay, so let's set up our t-chart. So the t-chart has x and y. The first number in our interval, which is a -2, is the same as saying x is equal to -2. So if we go to our table, we notice that there's your -2, and the y value or the function that goes with it is 85. So the first one will be -2 and 85. And then the same thing, this one here, it says less than 1. That's the same thing as saying x is equal to 1. So we look in our table for a +1, which is here, and then the x value, the y value that goes with it is a 10. So that means our order pair will be 110. Okay, now that we have our t-chart filled in, we can find our change. We can do our changes in our x and our changes in the y's. But we got to remember that the changes is subtraction. So that's going to be 85 minus 10, which is 75. And then we're going to do -2 minus 1, which is -3. Okay, now we're going to take and do our division. So we're going to set it up as being our change in our y value over our change in our x value. So our change in y was 75 divided by our change in x, which is -3. So if we go to Desmos and type that in, that's going to be 75 divided by -3. That's going to give us an answer of -25. So the average rate of change is -25 for that example. All right, so now that we have covered an example of each type, whether it be an equation, a graph, or a table, finding the average rate of change always going to end with you finding the change in your y, and then you're changing the x, and then dividing it. Basically, the dividing part is simplifying your changes. Okay? But we have to pay attention. Like in a table, we just picking out the points that matches the interval that they tell us. In a graph, we have to find the order pair that is on the line that matches the interval that they're telling us. And then in an equation, they're going to give us the interval. Then we have to plug that into the equation to get the y value or the result that will go along with that x. But if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask.